Have you ever walked away from a conversation and immediately started replaying it in your head? Maybe you started wondering, did I explain myself well enough? Do they think I'm lying? Should I have added more detail? What if they misunderstood me? And before you know it, you're mentally building an entire closing argument just to justify your own existence. You write paragraphs, you overclarify, you provide evidence nobody asked for. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You explain your motives before anyone questions them. And eventually, you become exhausted because over explaining is rarely just a communication habit. A lot of times, it's a survival response. And tonight, I want to talk about the hidden reason so many people over explain everything. Over explaining is often learned in chaos. Most chronic over explainers did not become that way randomly. Usually it started in environments where being misunderstood felt dangerous. Maybe you grew up around criticism, emotional volatility, blame shifting, unpredictability, punishment, or constant accusations. Maybe your intentions were regularly questioned. Maybe you were constantly interrupted before you could finish explaining yourself. Maybe you learned very young that if you didn't present enough evidence, people would assume the worst. So your nervous system adapted. You learned to over-prepare emotionally. You started explaining things before people even asked. You began trying to prevent conflict before it happened. And eventually, explaining yourself became second nature. Not because you were manipulative, but because part of you believed safety depended on being fully understood. Let's talk about the fear underneath it. Most over-explaining is rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of being misjudged, fear of being viewed as bad. And if we're being honest, a lot of over-explainers are deeply compassionate people. People who genuinely care. People who don't want to hurt others. People who spend enormous amounts of emotional energy trying to make sure everyone else feels okay. But the problem is that eventually the explaining becomes endless because there is no amount of detail that can force another person to see you accurately. And that realization is painful, especially for people who spent years believing if I just explain myself perfectly, then maybe I'll finally feel safe. Let's talk about the nervous system connection. This is where the nervous system piece becomes really important. Over-explaining is often connected to hypervigilance. Your brain becomes trained to scan for emotional danger constantly. You start monitoring facial expressions, tone changes, pauses, body language, energy shifts, text message timing. And then your nervous system tries to regain control by over-clarifying. You start emotionally flooding conversations with detail, not because you're trying to manipulate anyone, but because your body is trying to prevent rejection before it happens. A lot of over-explainers are not trying to control other people. They're trying to control the possibility of losing connection, and there's a difference. Why it often backfires. Ironically, over-explaining often creates the exact opposite of what people want, because confident people usually speak more directly. Healthy communication tends to sound calmer, shorter, more grounded. Meanwhile, panic energy can unintentionally communicate insecurity, and manipulative people take advantage of that. Because the more emotionally reactive someone becomes, the easier they are to destabilize. You start defending things that were never even accusations. You start giving people access to deeply personal, emotional explanations they never earned. And eventually you feel emotionally drained after even small interactions. Some people live this way for decades, always trying to make themselves understandable enough to deserve kindness. Let's talk about the grief of stopping. One of the hardest parts of healing is realizing that healthy people do not require a courtroom defense for every misunderstanding, and learning that can feel strangely uncomfortable. Because when you stop over explaining, you often feel guilty at first. You feel rude, cold, selfish, detached. But what's actually happening is that your nervous system is adjusting to boundaries. And sometimes people react strongly when you stop over explaining. especially people who benefited from your insecurity. Some people become uncomfortable when they no longer have unlimited access to your emotional labor. That realization can hurt deeply because healing sometimes reveals which relationships were built around your constant self-justification. What healthy communication actually looks like. Healthy communication does not require endless emotional proof. Sometimes healthy communication sounds like, "That's not what I meant," or "I understand you disagree," or simply, "I've already explained my perspective." And then stopping. No spiral, no essay, no emotional collapse, just clarity. A lot of healing involves learning that you are allowed to tolerate misunderstanding. Not everyone will interpret you correctly, and that does not make you unsafe. In closing, I think many over-explainers spent years believing their worth depended on how understandable they could make themselves. But the truth is, you cannot force emotional safety through perfect communication. Some people will misunderstand you no matter how carefully you explain yourself. And some people were never trying to understand you honestly in the first place. That's a hard realization, but it's also freeing because eventually healing sounds less like panic and more like peace, less like proving and more like grounding. You do not have to narrate your humanity to deserve basic respect. And you are allowed to stop treating every conversation like a courtroom. In closing, if this resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Recovering Perfectionist Mama for more conversations about trauma responses, boundaries, emotional healing, and the psychology behind people pleasing and overfunctioning. And if you've struggled with over explaining, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments down below. Thank you for tuning in to Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress. My name is Buffy, and I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in and for your support. It means a lot to me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope you'll come back and see me again soon. If you got value, please feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.